I'm very grateful to Archie for the invitation to speak today and organising the workshop. And I'd like to briefly cover 4 topics today. And the 4 topics are briefly to run through some definitions of maps and of woodland, to look briefly at certain types of estate mapping and their different values from the perspective of woodland. Some questions, what, where, and when, and then briefly finish up with the National Library of Scotland map website resources. And I know many of you will know historic maps very well, but I thought it was important to start with a bit of context, because map makers have often represented woodland in different ways and taken varying degrees of interest in it. If we go far back in time, the woodland shown by somebody like Timothy Pont may just indicate a general presence of certain types of woodland. If we look at something like the Roy Military Survey, they were often interested in woodland cover from the perspective of attack and defence, often ignoring smaller shrubs and plantations. And due to some elements of the map very much being sketched in, the woodland shown by Roy may well not always be a real representation, even of larger woods. I'd argue, in contrast, looking at this map again, estate maps have much larger scales and with a clear interest in measuring land and its resources can be accurate down to the last tree. And this may be true too of some types of more detailed Ordnance Survey mapping. An Ordnance Survey took a greater degree of interest in recording different types of trees and shrubs. Their maps may have a greater accuracy than previous maps, but their categorization and symbolization changed over time. So I think one of my main messages today is maps are never a straightforward facsimile of the landscape. They're never simple mirrors to the real world at a certain point in time, even if sometimes we today may wish them to be. And there are problems of definition too when it comes to woodland and what different types of map maker in the past did when they came to actually represent woodland on the map. This is the Cromarty estate that Archie looked at as well in Strathpeffer, and I'll look at it in more detail again soon. And maps like this can describe in detail things like alders, brambles, thorns, bushes, and brush, which had very clear but sometimes different meanings in the 18th century. And gathering a set of definitions from Thomas, who will speak several times today, there are various terms that can all describe different types of woodland. And more often than not, when we look at early maps, we're not given any explanation of what type of woodland they're choosing to record. Our various recent inventories that we have as well may also take a different view as to whether only some or all of these should be regarded as woodland. And it's a really important point in this because it gives rise to very different distribution maps of things like ancient woodland. So maps were made for very different purposes and audiences, and we can read them better with an understanding of this. Estate maps were very much instrumental in driving agricultural change. They were often commissioned by landowners for landowners, and they very deliberately pick out features of interest to a landowner. Most estate maps relate to the major era of agricultural improvement from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century, when the rural landscape was almost completely transformed. And so the story goes, under a prevailing spirit of improvement, the countryside was made more productive, more efficient, more lucrative for some people. New crops, new livestock, new rotations and tools. Waste and land was brought into productive use, and a new infrastructure of roads and bridges facilitated the movement of people and commodities. And this is a detail from an estate map by Cooper Angus, the estates of Keithick and Benachie. And the plan's significant in displaying both the contemporary landscape with irregular fields and firmtons, but also overlaying it, which you can see more clearly down below, with a neat, ordered, rectangular grid of the proposed fields to go in on the ground. But the map is useful too in indicating what was real woodland at the time, and a fir park and an oak park and other parts of the map as well. And surveyors like Thomas Winter, who drafted this map here, had quite extensive knowledge as well of things like land management and agricultural improvement, and acted as advisors to estate owners who were keen to undertake the new methods. Now, Timothy Pont's purpose, by way of contrast, was very different. It was not driven by any particular interest in agricultural improvement. His maps were far less detailed, and woodland was not a primary consideration. So his manuscript maps at one level can provide the first graphic depiction, really, of the site and shape and even sometimes the density of woodland. But they don't show woodland comprehensively at all. And they can sometimes also show whether woods were enclosed or open at this time. Occasionally, we're lucky too that different types of tree are actually described. This is on the south side of Loch Leven. And if we go a little further north, this is Strathneva, the wood of Strathneva, which he writes as a birch and holly wood. Now, the more comprehensive maps that were derived from Pont and published in Blau's Atlas of the mid-17th century are useful for areas with no surviving Pont map. They're clearer and easier to read, but they're often simplifying Pont's direct record of the landscape. And they also embellished, they prettified the maps. Sometimes trees were simply added for aesthetic reasons. As we've seen briefly before, the Royal Military Survey was driven very much by military requirements, and features of interest to an army commander, such as tree cover and woodland, can be very accurate. And of course, the Ancient Woodland Inventory uses the Royal Military Survey as the earliest reliable evidence for identifying ancient woodland, but it's created a number of problems. Some features and areas are far more reliable than others. Some woodland in some areas possibly sketched in or even missed. And on occasion, comparison with contemporary estate maps rather alarmingly show clear differences with plantations that were missed by the Roy surveyors. It may be too that sketching from the ground was more likely to exaggerate the extent of real woodland cover, and there was no attempt to distinguish different types of trees. So that's enough by way of a background, and I'd like to now look at different types of estate mapping, returning again to this map of the Strathpeffer area from Cromarty Estates. Now this map, as you can hopefully see from the frame, hangs on a wall in a castle in Strathpeffer, and the thanks are very much due to their owner, as well as to the North of Scotland Archaeological Society that Archie mentioned, who were able to get images of the maps made and sent to us for putting on our website. This map is a product of the Board Annexed for Fated Estates, which was formed in 1755 with responsibilities to manage 13 of the largest pro-Jacobite estates that had risen up against the crown in the 45. And their remit was very much to convince the inhabitants of these estates that life under the Hanoverians was infinitely preferable to the Stuarts. They promoted the Protestant religion, loyalty to the British government, and also promoted radical new agricultural communications and manufacturing developments. Whether they achieved all their aims is debatable, but they certainly made very successful achievements in land surveying, because the Act empowered the commissioners to have the confiscated estates capability and the overall land assessed, with improvements being recommended. And a number of highly skilled surveyors, including Peter May, his map here was copied by John Ainsley, produced highly attractive and detailed maps, often the earliest detailed maps of the landscape for these particular areas. And their record of the woodland, as we've seen earlier, is very detailed. And in a similar way, many of the larger estates in the borders employed land surveyors to plan their gardens, their policies, along with broader surveys of the wider agricultural estate. This map is by Matthew Stobie, surveying Minto House and Grounds, 5 miles or so northeast of Hawick, and usefully showing many different types and densities of woodland cover, including hedges and formal gardens. John Home surveyed Assynt between June and September 1774. This was the earliest detailed, comprehensive mapping of Assynt. It was also the most expensive survey made in the entire 18th century for Sutherland estates. And Home also helpfully shows not only woodland, but the types of tree too, in this case primarily birchwood. And just to say as well, Sutherland estates deposited most of their maps in the NLS 30 years ago, and it's thanks to this and their generosity in allowing their maps to be scanned and put online that we've now got very good online coverage of estate mapping in Sutherland. Zooming off down to the southwest, this is the earliest detailed estate map for the area to the west of Loch Rutton, about 5 miles southwest of Dumfries. And along with many other rural areas, this area was the focus of agricultural improvement. Maps like this providing the basis for reorganized, more productive farming techniques. And sometimes, as for this area, we're lucky to have something of a succession of estate maps for the same place. This later map of Loch Rutton from 1815 shows slightly more extensive woodland cover, but largely including all of the woodland cover shown in the 1770s. I had to include this map, seeing it's where we are today, and Archie included it in our publicity. And it's not strictly speaking an estate map, but a map portraying a legal dispute between the legal dispute over the route to be taken by the Union Canal, which snakes across here in red. And it illustrates really the value of other types of map at this time in illustrating woodland. It's drawn with south at the top, so the edge of Falkirk squeezes in slightly to the right-hand side. And William Forbes, the owner of Callander, forced the Union Canal Company to take a more difficult line than the one that was approved in the parliamentary bill, and to build a tunnel so the views from the estate would not be marred by canal traffic. And this is why we've got this excellent record of woodland in Callander at this time. And estate maps too can be quite useful for what may be urban areas today. This estate of Ravelston and Corstorphine Hill is only 2 miles west of the centre of Edinburgh, west of Edinburgh Castle, owned by the Keith family at this time. And rising up on this side to Corstorphine Hill, which is, I think, established today as a long-established plantation woodland. But maps like this, recording it too as plantation at this time, are useful in our overall chronology of maps through time. So at last on to the subject that Archie asked me to talk about, a little about what, where and when. Let's look at what exists, where it covers, when was it made. Now this is a flying overview. It would be nice to give a more comprehensive picture, but we can't do that as so many of these estate plans are held in private hands. According to Ian Adams, who actively researched estate plans in Scotland in the 1970s and 1980s, he reckoned that there were around about 50,000 estate maps in Scotland, although he doesn't go into the detail of quite where that number comes from. It was based particularly on the National Register of Archive surveys done, where they actively visited and reviewed private estate archives. The national institutions like the National Records of Scotland and the NLS hold only a proportion of this largesse, and I would argue have not done as well in recent years as volunteer groups in actually making them available. NRS claim to have 170,000 maps and plans. Many of these are architectural drawings, they're engineering plans, they don't relate to landscape or woodland. A much smaller number, the register house plans, these again will include architectural and building survey. Around 7,000 are available online on the Scotland's People website, and they do include a lot of early estate maps. NLS, we have around 2,500 estate maps. Only 1,200 available online, and the reasons for this are primarily due to the fragility of the estate mapping, the fact that it's bound or sometimes very large, and we lack the technical means to safely copy it. And so it's something that we hope to chip away at and improve on. And to that number have come the extremely important and useful numbers from DAMP and also from the Lovat estate mapping project. HES has many estate maps and other maps. Many of these are available on Scotland's Places, university archives, special collections, local public libraries. But by far the largest quantities are those still in private ownership. And looking at what we know, the NLS online maps, this is around 2,500 estate maps, and those are the parishes that we have coverage of, a very scattered picture. And I try to group it into clusters, effectively 4 main categories, 500-ish relating to Sutherland estates, 600-ish relating to Lovat estates, bulked out by some NLS maps. The bulk of these in the southwest, of course, come from DAMP, and then a miscellany of other estate maps as well. And this bar chart really underlines how extremely useful the DAMP work has been, as well as the Lovat project, in locating and scanning estate maps in private hands. In terms of distribution over time, that's a bit of a cop-out this, but all I'm going to do is show this graph produced by Ian Adams, which measures the man-years of estate surveyors from 1700 through to 1850. There was a sharp rise up to the 1770s, and then economics, particularly the Napoleonic Wars, saw a lull of activity, and then a bit of a post-Napoleonic boom before a general decline in the 19th century. So I'd like to finish up by looking at NLS website resources. And I hope many of you will be very familiar with our online maps. But brief talks like this are always a useful opportunity to bring you up to date with things and some recent changes. And I'd like to show you our new guides, how you can reuse georeference maps in other software, and also how you can now georeference other maps online. So we now have just over 250,000 maps online, and these are all of the single sheet maps of Scotland that we've been able to scan in our holdings. A lot of our future work will chip away at those that were unable to be copied with earlier scanning, but more of that work will look at expanding geographically beyond Scotland. And if you scroll down our homepage, down to the footer, there is a link to research guides. And these are a slowly growing set of pages that aim to provide some help on researching specific topics, which can include things like climate change, house and building history and local history, and researching woodland history. Now, I'm not suggesting any of you will have much to learn from this, but it tries to run through the most useful maps for researching woodland history, only some of which I've covered in this brief talk today. And I should say this page was considerably improved through a constructive dialogue with a certain Mr. McConnell, who you may know. Now, I hope you'll all know how to find estate maps. There's really three main ways. If you go into the blue button for estate maps, you find them arranged textually by county and then by parish. We have two ways we call Map Finder, one where you put a pin on where you're interested in, and the maps that cover the pin come back. And then the Map Finder with outlines that presents the parish boundaries that I just showed earlier. And if you know the name of a map maker, you can also browse an alphabetical list of map makers. And so hopefully once you've then found your map, you get a brief record of the map, an image you can click on. As you see, a clear credit here to the institution or place that the maps have come from. We're very keen to do that for the owners of these maps or those involved in curating them. And if you're lucky, you'll find that it's been georeferenced through Thomas's good work on his PhD. And if you click that link, then you will view this map. This is of the lands of Blackwood, superimposed on a modern satellite image. And of course, once georeferenced, you can do a lot more with these maps, as you will know. You can compare them to multiple other layers of mapping, to other data sets. You can use things like measurement tools to measure distances and areas and change the transparency to compare it with background layers. You can drape it across a landscape in our Explore georeference maps in 3D viewer, which we've actually recently enhanced to try and improve it a little. And you can increase vertical exaggeration and change the transparency as well. In our side-by-side viewer, you can do things like compare it to first edition OS 6-inch to the mile mapping from the mid-19th century, compare it to satellite imagery, or a recent-ish development in the last year, compare it to the growing coverage of LiDAR layers that the Scottish government have made available. You can see, really, with the satellite imagery, that it flattens the landscape. It's sometimes difficult to pick out the topography, but with LiDAR, it can really come alive at a very detailed level. And the LiDAR coverage for southern Scotland is really very good these days. Many of you will be proficient GIS users, and it's also possible to bring any of our georeference layers, including all of these estate maps, into ArcGIS or QGIS. In our Explore Georeference Maps viewer, if you click the Overlay button, it will bring up a link which, if you click on it, gives the URL to the tile set, the customized layer that brings the map into QGIS. And then, going back to our research guides, there's a research guide on reusing georeference maps. And we created a step-by-step workflow on how to bring these layers into QGIS or into ArcGIS. This could be for things like tracing features or gathering annotations with everything that's recorded in its real-world location. So this shows that estate map of Blackwood brought into QGIS with an open street map background. But it's also possible to bring into QGIS 2, for example, the Ordnance Survey first edition mapping, or later layers of OS mapping, and to directly compare things like the woodland here that's shown in the 1780s, to directly compare it with the more extensive but still quite similar woodland on later maps. And the final new initiative I just wanted to mention is we're working on a way that anyone can actually have a go at georeferencing any of our online maps, including other damp ones that haven't been georeferenced, and I'll just illustrate that quickly. When you view any of our maps in the standard zoomable viewer, there's this Show AAAF button here, which doesn't mean anything to most people, but if you click on it, it uses an open protocol, the International Image Interoperability format. And with the link, it allows the zoomable, non-georeferenced image to be brought into other tools, one of which is called the All Maps editor. And All Maps is a project, an open source project that has been largely done by a chap called Bert Spaan, who's based in the Netherlands. He's very much a map enthusiast, some funding from a few libraries. And what the All Maps editor allows you to do is click on a point on the map. This is a James Wells map of East Blackshore, near the kind of eastern mouth of the River Nith estuary. You click on one point on the left-hand map, click on its real-world location on the right-hand Esri topographic layer, and once you've built up a few points of the same place, you can toggle the right-hand layer with a satellite view or map view, and then crop the area around it, and then, broadly speaking, with a bit of luck, the map can be presented as an overlay on top of the real world. And again, you can toggle the background and give it a satellite background as well. So lots of fun to be had, time to be wasted. I'll just mention we produce a 6-monthly newsletter called CARE. If you don't receive it and are interested, I bought a few copies today. It's free, and if you want to receive it, just let us know. We'll add your name into the mailing list. So that's our website. Very grateful to you for listening in today. I hope some of what I've had to say is new. And maybe I'll just finish, if I've got time, with 2 very quick points. The first is to say NLS is very keen and happy to receive images of maps if their owners are happy for them to be put online. And this has advantages, as I hope I've illustrated, in not just online accessibility and the other things that can be done with an image, but also, I would argue, in the long-term preservation of those images as well. And secondly, to say NLS is also very keen to work with other institutions and people collaboratively. The work that DAMP had done, and also Lovett Estates, of locating maps, liaising with their owners, often recording metadata on the maps, georeferencing, transcription, and publicity, all really useful work that we in NLS don't have the capacity or ability to do as well. But in my opinion, it's been a very happy collaboration with benefits for both parties, and I hope that we can extend that kind of model for other collections as well. Thank you very much.